Hi. So I'm Amanda Lamond. I'm the director of the Center for Integrative Law. And today I'm going to be interviewing Kim Wright. Kim is one of my friends, my mentors, and my heroes. She is the author of two amazing books. So her first book is called Lawyers as Peacemakers. And the second book, which is even more amazing, is called Lawyers as Changemakers. Kim has spent most of her life traveling the world, creating the integrative law movement, and she's going to tell us what that means and tell us about her life and her journey and what it means to be an integrative lawyer. So Kim, welcome and thank you.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start by just asking you, what drew you to the law?
Well, the truth is that when I went to law school, I thought I was just going because our family needed a lawyer. We had a big family, a blended family. We had 7 children who had 9 parents. And so it was a very complex situation. And I thought, well, I'll just go to law school and it'll be easier. And I had no idea what it meant to go to law school. I didn't know that it was supposed to be hard, that it was hard to get in, that it was a hard career or anything. It's just, I'd seen lawyers on TV. And so I decided to go. And when I got there, I was just really surprised because the people were actually mean. And I was this person who, I was mom. I did volunteer work with children in the court system, and I, fought for civil rights, and I had my big family and all of that. And 2 guys actually came to me and they said they had been sent by a committee that said I was doing too much and that I needed to come into line. And I was like, so foreign to me. Apparently they were watching me and they were in competition with me. I did not even know they existed. They were so not on my radar. And at that moment, I decided I was not going to be a lawyer because lawyers were just jerks. And so I went out, I ran a domestic violence program. I did, sort of what I call social work law. I passed 2 bar exams, but I wasn't actually practicing law. And I moved to another state and I was taking some personal growth kinds of work. And I was in a seminar and this guy stood up and he started to introduce himself. He was from out of town and was visiting the seminar. And he said, "My name is Forrest Baird. I'm a lawyer." And then I thought, well, that's really interesting. I want to know more about him because he's a lawyer. And he looks like a nice man. And, in my world, lawyers were jerks. And he started talking about how he practiced law to grant dignity to everyone in the process, and that he was a divorce lawyer, and he thought it was his job to make sure that the husband and wife were still friends at the end of the process because they had to raise their children together. And I always describe this as like everything went from black and white to color. I knew that that's what I wanted to do and that I could do that. And so I immediately went and took my 3rd bar exam in the new state, and I started to be a lawyer. And my first week of law practice, I opened a law practice sharing an office with a more experienced lawyer, and I went out with my first client, and I discovered that there actually were a lot of jerks out there. I always have this impression like I hit the courthouse wall. I went out with all of my ideals and my, Don Quixote sword and went flat up against it. But the difference was I actually knew that something else was possible. And before I quit, because I didn't know anything else was possible, and Forrest Baird gave me that possibility, and I decided that I would create that legal system.
Was that enough, just having met this one lawyer? So now you hit up against this wall of realizing, look, I'm actually kind of right. Everybody, is a jerk, and this is a very hard system to be in. What kept you going?
I think I'm one of those people. If you tell me I can't do it, I am much more inclined to do it. And before, I just didn't have that possibility. Like I didn't have any hope that it could be a different way, and little sliver of hope he gave me. And then he introduced me to other people. He was a collaborative lawyer, which I learned later, and he introduced me to Stuart Webb, who was the creator of collaborative law. And I started meeting holistic lawyers, and I realized that there were other people out there and I wasn't alone.
So then where did your journey take you after that? From being was it predominantly a divorce lawyer that you were then, or did you do lots of different types of law?
At first I did anything that came in the door. Here we call it door law. I had a
door law.
We call it door law. If it walks in the door and they can write a check, you take it. Okay. And so I actually did a couple of criminal cases, which was not my thing. And I had a little old lady who came in because the stockbroker had turned her entire estate and she had nothing left. And she was a widow and he had taken all of the money her husband had left her. And so that was, some securities kind of law. And, I actually ended up referring her to a securities specialist, but I worked with her for quite some time before we found the right person. And I did some divorce law and I did contracts. One of the things that happened was that when I was working with divorce clients, they very often were business owners. And when I did work with them in a different way, they said, I really would love for you to represent me in my business. And so I would do their contracts and help them resolve the conflicts that came up in business. And so I started doing a lot of different things. And then later I did mediation and collaborative law and restorative justice and therapeutic jurisprudence. And I became really hungry for all of the new things that were going on that were in the realm of peacemaking and healing rather than being more adversarial.
So then what moved you? You had this appetite, you were doing, I also recall you saying a lot of personal development work constantly on growing and changing yourself, and then learning all of these different modalities of law, but you were still kind of practicing, I don't know if I can say, as a small town lawyer. So what was the shift that led to you kind of, on this trajectory of becoming a worldwide leader in this movement, the shift from being a small town lawyer to suddenly traveling the world? How did that come about?
Well, I actually had, in the town where I practiced, there were about 5,000 people. And my office was, walk out the one-story building and walk across the street into the courthouse. I mean, it was really a small town. The county had 100,000 people, so it was really big. And it was a great place to experiment because I always said, if I can do it here, it can be done anywhere. And a lot of things happened. My husband in 1999 got a job offer in Portland, Oregon, all the way across the country. And I was not a member of the bar. And at first he just moved there to see if he was going to like it. And I had a daughter in high school. I thought, well, we won't move her. In a couple of years, we'll see if he's still there. Then, we'll have a long distance relationship until then. And the first time we visited, she said, I'd really like to move here. And so I always describe it like I was pulled up by the roots because I was really in that community. We had groups at the schools. We did. We were called the Divorce and Family Law Center, and I had a counselor who had been a school counselor who worked for me, who did divorce support groups in the schools for children whose parents were going through divorce. I did programs about how to go through.
You run those programs for the kids.
My office sponsored them, and it was run by a guidance counselor. With a lot of experience working with children.
What a wonderful initiative.
We won awards for that, and there was a women's center that I offered a 6-week course on healing through divorce, to looking at all of the aspects of divorce, the emotional and the logistical and the children and the finances and all of those things that are kind of like a bowl of spaghetti, I always used to say. They're all wrapped up together. You pull one thing and something else on the other side wiggles. And so I helped people to see all of that as, different aspects of the divorce. And so and I had support groups in my office. I had students come from the social work school and intern with me, and from the law school. And so we had a men's group and a women's group, and we were really doing a lot of different activities in this small town. And so when it came time to move, it was just like, it was traumatic. And I moved cross country, and my agreement with my husband was he was going to work for Intel, and I was going to figure out how to make a living. And I had a year to figure it out. But during that time, I started reaching out to people who I knew, and I was asked to do something for the International Alliance of Holistic Lawyers, and I ended up talking to a lot of people, and I started seeing that holistic law was part of something bigger, and that there really wasn't anything out there that was talking about things like emotional intelligence in law, and appreciative inquiry, and collaborative law, and all of the things that I've mentioned. There was nothing out there. So in my spare time, I wrote a website which ended up being 400 pages long, and was the predecessor of the Lawyers as Peacemakers book. So I just started collecting information, and at the time, this was in the early days of the web. This was 20 years ago. And there weren't very many websites, and there was no way to know who was visiting your website. It was just, you could put a clicker on there, and every time somebody visited, it would click. And I had
there was no Google, no Facebook, no.
There was, like most people didn't have the internet yet. Some of them didn't have fax machines yet. I mean, it was really a long time ago in technology land. But I ended up having this website with 100,000 visitors in 1 year. And given that the web was so new, that was a huge number of people, and I had no idea who they were. So I just put out a note on the website, and I said, we're going to have a gathering. And somehow along the way, people contacted me. Like I would get emails that said, I just found your website, and I thought I was alone. And I'm just, I'm just crying here, to know that I'm not alone, and that this exists has changed my life. And can I talk to you? And so for that year, I had phone call after phone call and email exchange after email exchange. And I just kind of made a list of people. And so I emailed them, and I put something out on the website, and I said, we're going to have 100 people who are going to become founders of an organization. And it ended up being called Renaissance Lawyer. And we're going to have a gathering, in September, whatever that was. And I think 30 people will come, but we're going to have 100 people who are founding members. And we did exactly have 100 people who were founding members, and 30 people actually did come. And we started having these conversations together. And so my role became connecting people and bringing new information. And, eventually I started training people in the things that I knew about. And, fast forward a few years, I'd been doing that work and applying it in my practice. I became a mediator in Oregon, and then I moved back to North Carolina so I could actually practice law, because I was a member of the bar and by then a divorced lawyer. I started imagining that this community needed something else, and maybe what they needed was a magazine. And people were encouraging me. We had a newsletter that went from just, like a little email to 15 printed pages, if you printed it out, that just said, this is what's going on. We called it the cable. It was the thing that connected us. People would tell me, oh, I'm doing this in Hawaii, and I'm doing this in Texas. And we put a paragraph of what they were up to, and then I had people who came and tried to help me, and it got to be too much. So I started putting this stuff on the web, and then we decided we needed a magazine. And I spent 2 years trying to create a magazine at about the time that the whole magazine industry collapsed. And so we had our prototype, we had our funding, and the Independent Press Association at a meeting I was attending said, it's the day of the website. And they dissolved the organization. and so I went back on the web. And Renaissance Lawyer was by then a freestanding organization, and that's when I created Cutting Edge Law. And I created a website that I had to learn to program it and everything. It's still there. I can't possibly keep it up to date anymore. But cuttingedgelaw.com talked about these, and in 2008 I decided I was going to interview people. And before that we had dial-up, and the bandwidth was so it was so low that you couldn't actually put a video up, and then we could. So I decided I would take a video camera and I would travel to conferences and to meet people who I had been inspired by. And I ended up with the Cutting Edge Law YouTube channel, which has about 350 videos. They're in 10-minute increments, so there were over 100 people who were interviewed who were pioneers. And that was the beginning of my traveling around the world. I started in the US because that's where I was. And I gave up my house, gave up my office, closed my law office. And, I was just talking about this today. There's like this huge leap that was sort of horrifying. Like I gave up my house and my office, and I had no place to go except what I could build in front of me. And so I created Cutting Edge Law, I created the YouTube channel, and then in 2009, the American Bar Association actually noticed what I was doing, and they declared that I was a legal rebel, which is what the designation they have for the visionaries in the legal field. And it was the first time I'd gotten mainstream attention. And then they asked me if I would write a book. And it never, in my wildest dreams, would I have thought that the ABA would come to me and ask me to write a book. But then I did write Lawyers as Peacemakers. It became a bestseller on the day it was released, even in pre-release. And then from that point, I started getting invitations to go around the world. And so I've now been on every continent, worked with lawyers in more countries than I've counted. I've been to South Africa several times. It's been a long time. I miss it. Cape Town is one of my favorite places. And there are groups of people and centers and secret Facebook groups and other authors, and this has really become a movement, which I am proud to be part of, and part of showcasing and nurturing and encouraging people to create this.
So what separates an integrative lawyer from a non-integrative lawyer? When someone maybe who's not even a lawyer says to you, like, well, what is integrative law? And I kind of understand that the terminology developed. So you started off with this movement called holistic law, and then you were calling yourself Renaissance lawyers, and now integrative lawyers. So how do you explain it simply, like you're sitting on an airplane, as you often do, or used to before the world went mad? And someone says, so what's integrative law? How do you explain it to them?
When I started to write my second book, which the ABA also asked me to write, I wanted to find a way to define it. We had a conference shortly after the first book, and we had 30 people who came who were leaders in different parts of the movement, and they arrived as 30 different representatives of different approaches. So there were collaborative lawyers, and there were judges and sharing lawyers and conscious contracts and restorative justice. So they all came from what seemed to be different movements. And they spent the day together, and then the next morning they said, we know that we're part of something, and we need a name. And that's where the name Integrative Law came from. that those 30 people spent 5 minutes and agreed on the name. So I thought that was, I mean, a group of 30 lawyers agreed on something in 5 minutes. That's a miracle.
That is a miracle. I agree.
And so we named it, and then we set out to define it. And so when I wrote the book, I decided to ask people, what do they think it is? Or tell us a story about it. Or, I would know what they were doing, and I would say, I see that's integrative law, so write about that. And I had 111 contributions. And that's the book. My book is like a tour of that. And so when I got those 111 in, I looked at them and I said, well, what does this tell me? What is this thing that all these people have written about? And I came up with 4 pillars. And the pillars that I saw were that integrative lawyers are reflective, and that can be about personal growth. It can be about emotional intelligence. It can be about being contemplative. It's being willing to critique oneself, and to for some people it's like there must be something wrong with me, and they go into therapy because they're in the law and they're not fitting, because that other law, they're hitting the courthouse wall, and they think there must be something.
One of the characteristics is that all of the integrative lawyers feel like they don't belong in the system. Would you say that that's kind of a joining thread in some ways?
I think that sense of that we're all alone until we find each other is pretty much there. In the 20 years that I've been collecting people, I hear that almost all the time. The first contact, somebody will say, I thought I was alone and I found you. And now I know I'm not alone. And, some people say, well, just thank you. And mostly I say, well, let's have a chat. And then they're like, oh my God, you really would chat with me. And I'm like, okay, I chat with everybody.
Well, I was one of those people. I mailed you and I found your website, and like, you just sound completely amazing. And everything that I'd been writing about on my little blog, it was like, someone else thinks all of these things too. And you said, yeah, let's talk. And I was like, exactly the same. Wow. You're gonna talk to me?
Well, I look at what that's brought us. I so treasure what happened after that. If you had never reached out to me, there would be a big hole in my life that I wouldn't even know what was missing.
And all of these integrative lawyers in South Africa would still be thinking that they are alone.
They are alone, right?
Yes, but we bring it back to the pillars. So, because I helped you digress there. So, reflective is the first pillar, and then
the second one is values and purpose oriented. And so we start, when we're doing that personal work, we often start inquiring into who am I and what's important to me. And that's a question about what your values are and what is your purpose. And then that kind of bleeds into, well, what's the purpose of law and what are the values of the legal system and how can I be me and still be a lawyer? So that's the next pillar. And then the third pillar is that lawyers, integrative lawyers, are systems thinkers and legal designers. And those are in some ways two things, and in some ways they're related. So, for example, if you look at systems theory, then you will see that we're all connected into a system, and the behavior of one person in a system can actually impact the rest of the system. And then the legal designers look at that system and then they say, well, how can I do that? How can I make a difference? How can I design a process that actually has the outcome I want? So legal design can be a lot of things. It can be about art and law. It can be the design thinking model includes empathy. Really, it's very client-centered. And so there's a lot. I mean, I wrote a book about that. There's a lot more I could say, but I'll tell you the next pillar is about harbingers of a new consciousness. because there is this consciousness in the world where people are realizing their connectedness, and now more than ever, we cannot be isolated from each other. The pandemic is showing how very interconnected we are. But that sense of interconnectedness, and that one person can make a difference, and along with that sometimes comes that courage to try something different. And so those are the 4 pillars.
And so if a student is listening to this and thinking, okay, I think that I want to know more about this, what resources would you direct them to apart from your 2 books? Is there stuff that they can watch online? What should they search for? So resources. And then the other piece that I want you to comment on is, what personal development work or steps should they take, themselves? Because obviously information is just one piece.
So I will email some things to anybody who wants, first of all, so that they don't have to buy the book. I can send a couple of chapters that are introductory chapters, and if you have good internet, the YouTube channel they're in 10-minute increments, so it's not like having to download an entire hour long. When I started putting things on YouTube, you could only do 10 minutes. And so there are about 100 different individuals and about 350 10-minute segments that are interviews with people all over the U.S. pretty much. There are a couple of people international, but it was from before my international travels that I created those. But the stories are just amazing. I went and found one today. The woman who started the first mental health court, she was a real estate lawyer, and they appointed her to the bench. And somebody came into her court, and this woman had obviously had a mental breakdown, and she had robbed somebody at a cash machine. And the woman said, the victim said, clearly there's something wrong. She didn't seem to be the kind of person who would have done that. And she didn't seem like she was in her right mind. And the judge said, well, what do I do in a case like this? And what was available to her was to put this woman in jail. And she said, I'm not going to do that. And she instead sentenced her to treatment, and with the permission of the victim, and that created the first mental health court. And now they're all over the world, so that when someone has a mental health issue that causes them to create a crime, they treat the mental health issue rather than putting them in jail. So,
unfortunately, that doesn't exist in South Africa, and I'm quite sure it's not something I've studied, but that there are a huge number of mentally ill people who are in our prison system with no hope of actually getting out, because they're not getting the treatment that they need while they're in there. So we're going to have to kind of wrap up quite soon, but to just return to this thing of processes, because you mentioned the reflective, this first pillar being the reflective one. So what would students do in order to kind of begin this process of self-inquiry?
Well, I think even though it's out of order, I would say that working on your own personal values and your purpose, like why, your big why, which, if you look into organizational development, there are lots of books and resources and websites about that. What is your personal why? And you need to anchor yourself in that. And when, in the legal profession, there are lots of opportunities to not be in integrity with that. And I think that leads to a lot of feeling like you don't belong. People are accused of, being too emotional because they really care. And, I'm like, yes, these are the people who ought to be in law. We have to find ways to take care of ourselves with that passion, but let's bring the passion in. And so if you're anchored in your values and you know who you are, then you can always return back to that. And then you can look and see what's your next best action based on who you are and what's important to you.
Okay. And let's just maybe end with an example of one lawyer who kind of there are hundreds, as you said, hundreds and thousands worldwide. Yeah. But a story of just one that would help capture an integrative lawyer.
I think I will tell you about Rob DeRoy. So your professor actually hosted an integrative law event, the very first one in South Africa, and I met Rob at that. And Rob's a commercial lawyer and, you know, really wonderful human being. And one of the things that came to him was he was concerned about people who were working in his home who didn't have contracts, and you know that he was afraid that people who were in those kinds of jobs might be exploited by others. And he decided to create a contract that was easy to understand, that everybody would be able to use it, and you wouldn't be dependent on you know, knowing a lot of the language, and you know, not a 6,000 word multi-page document, but actually a comic. And he created the comic contract. And as far as I know, he created the first one in the world. And he did it with domestic help, and he did it with farmhands. And he's won international awards now for this. And there are now international conferences. I went to one in Australia where he was one of the guests. And in Australia, they've actually now taken that movement on, and they're creating comic contracts for an engineering firm with 7,000 employees for their employment contract. So Rob is a great example of someone who, you know, he brought his passion, the things that he really loved, to his work. He created something different using a legal design tool, and he's, you know, really bringing into being a new consciousness and a new way of practicing law.
So he's done contracts for domestic workers, and I also know he did one for farm workers who were largely illiterate. And so that one was also in comic form. And I'll post some links along with this interview so that students can go and see an article about him and an example of his contract. And maybe I can interview him too.
That would be really lovely.
Kim, I think we're going to have to wrap up. The bandwidth crazy there. So you turned into a big, blurry, amorphous blob. So I apologize for that. See your face again. And I'm sensing that we may have to have a part 2 to delve a little bit more deeply into this thing, the process about becoming an integrative lawyer. And you know, while you were talking, it just occurred to me these things that law school is going to try and force you some other way. They're going to tell you that you're not good enough. They're going to tell you that being emotional is not a good thing. Those things we touched on. And then you enter the profession and there's more of that. So holding your ground and saying, this is who I am, this is my why, and I'm okay. I think that students could use a lot more, like for us to explore that a bit more of how you hold your center.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that.
Thanks.
It's one of the things I love to talk about most.
Well, then we look forward to part 2. And I know that it is probably nearing 3 o'clock in the morning, your side. You are a night owl, but even so, that's very late. Thank you so much. And thank you for the work that you do in the world.
It's always my pleasure. It's good to see you.
Goodbye, Kim. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.